Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet here at the Hudson Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague Jeff Lee. He and I have worked on a paper for the past year on trying to measure the economic contribution of the Internet, or more specifically the information and communications and technology sector, to the U.S. economy. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, September 18th, Thursday, September 18th, my colleague Rob McDowell will be having a session with Representative Anna Eshoo from California here at Hudson, and everyone's welcome to that. It's on the 18th of September. For our online viewers, welcome, and questions can be submitted to, what is the current hashtag? Just Hudson hashtag Hudson Institute, or at Hudson Institute. Please feel free to submit questions. For those of you in our live audience, please continue with your lunch. We will get started. I will begin today's session with just a brief overview of why it's important to be able to measure the size of the Internet economy to the U.S. And then Jeff will describe the research that we've done and the findings that we have, and then at the end I'll try to pull it all together again, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience and from our online viewers as well. All of us know that the Internet's important to the economy. It's changed the way we live. It's changed the way we work. It's had a very major effect on the economy. But exactly how much has the Internet contributed to the American economy? You won't be able to find a federal agency that has a measure of this. If you go over to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they measure GDP, they measure a lot of things, but you won't find a specific category that says this is the Internet economy. Same for the Census Bureau, same for Bureau of Labor Statistics, and all of the government agencies that go about measuring different amounts of activity in our economy. We don't have a very specific measure for how much has the Internet contributed to the economy. If you're hoping that we're going to have a very specific measure of that, I'm afraid you may be disappointed. But we will at least begin to come up with some measures of the ICT sector, information, communications, and technology sector, that are consistent with the National Income and Product Accounting system that the Bureau of Economic Analysis of the Department of Commerce has. Well, why is measuring growth of the Internet important? And let me just give you a few areas where I think it's very important. Tax policy, the types of tax credits for investment in Internet plant and equipment. We have a lot of ways of looking at that. It would be nice to figure out whether they're having any actual effect on economic activity or not. And right now we don't have a very good way of measuring that. Taxation of Internet transactions. It's a very important issue for state and local governments in terms of tax collection. Again, we don't have very precise ways of measuring the extent of Internet transactions. Federal tax policy with respect to corporations, the jurisdictional location of those corporations. The online economy is a very big business, but again, we don't have exact and precise ways of measuring that. Regulatory policy. At the Federal Communications Commission, network neutrality is one of the very hot topics there right now. And a lot of that has to do with perceived effects of regulation on internet activity. Well, if we don't have a very good measure of what internet activity is relative to the economy, we have a very difficult time of knowing if and whether increased or decreased federal regulation of the internet would have any effect on the type of regulatory policies we should be pursuing. The FCC is planning major auctions of spectrum, one later this year for AWS-3, another in the next year or two for the 600 megahertz broadcast spectrum. The value of that spectrum depends very much on the value of internet activity. The bidders have a very good idea of what they're willing to spend, but how much economic activity is actually going on as a result, at least at a public level, at a governmental level, we don't have a very good measure of that. Various other forms of regulation of the internet, from access to networks to regulation of advertising to regulation of competition, all of these are activities which are very much under consideration at the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. Without very accurate or meaningful measures of the economic contribution of these sectors to the economy and the effect of regulation on them, it's hard to know whether these types of regulations will have any beneficial effect or any adverse effect. Government expenditures. The government spends a lot of money on internet-related activities, from the 2009 stimulus bill, which spent billions of dollars on internet plant and equipment, to the current Federal Universal Service Fund program, particularly for schools and libraries, which is very much focused on internet access. We can measure how much money the government spends. We have a much more difficult time measuring what the effect on the economy has been. At the Labor Department, job training and education programs, very much focused on internet-related activities. Again, it's very difficult to measure the efficacy of these programs without having some way of measuring the overall level of internet activity in the economy. The effects of other policy issues such as privacy, national security, a lot of regulation at privacy at every federal agency, and every state agency has privacy rules. What are the effects of these rules on economic activity? National security concerns, particularly with through the NSA. What are the effects of NSA practices on the economy? Well, the absence of actual federal information on the size of the internet economy has not stopped political rhetoric about how big the internet economy is. In our paper, which there's a link to at the Hudson website, we review just a few examples of some of the political rhetoric that has surrounded the size of the internet economy. Even in the absence of actual numbers, a great many politicians are very eager to describe the enormous contribution of the internet to the American economy. And I don't think anyone would dispute that the effect and the contribution is quite substantial. When you actually get to quantification, and politicians there seems to be an arms race to see who can attribute the greatest amount to the internet, whether it goes from 10% to 15% to 20% to 25%. There's a great deal of rhetoric surrounding the contribution of the internet to the economy. And yet we really know very little. about exactly how much there is. If we look, for example, at the Bureau of Economic Analysis information, I'm going to turn to page 7 in our report. The ICT sector, which includes both the direct internet service providers on the service side, but all telecommunications, all broadcasting, all movies, all computer programming, all information in the economy. If we look at it on a gross output level, between 1997 and 2007, the ICT sector was somewhere between 3.5% and roughly 3.9% of the economy. These are not overwhelmingly large numbers. They're much smaller than I think a lot of us would assume the internet economy to be. And with good reason. There are large parts of the internet economy that are not captured in the ICT sector. So Amazon, for example, is engaged in retail sales. Retail sales are a different sector of the economy. Almost every business in America has some form of internet activity that isn't necessarily captured in the ICT sector. So one of the puzzles that Jeff and I sought to solve, or at least to begin to understand, is, well, we all have a general idea that the internet's very important to the economy, but if you look at the actual government information, we're down at a pretty small level if we look at just the ICT sector. I just described the overall expenditures. I've done some work in the past on value added, which is another way of looking at the contributions, and I've looked at the wireless sector of the economy, and you get numbers when you add a lot of things together on the value added side. You get numbers in the high single digits, 7, 8, 9%. It's hard to get quite to 10% value added from the wireless sector. There are a couple of other ways of looking at economic activity. One has to do with input-output tables, and another has to do with looking at technical change analyses. And that is, those last two approaches are where Jeff and I started our analysis approximately a year ago, is taking a look at some information that the Department of Commerce has with its national input-output data that it produces years after the fact. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff at this point to describe our approach and describe some of the results we got.
Hi, everyone. Is this a good volume? I'd first just like to thank you all for coming and hearing this talk. Thanks Hudson Institute for holding this event, inviting me to present this research that we've done over the last year, and also thank Harold for being a great mentor during this research project. So the topic is, or the question that we're answering is, how much is the internet worth to the economy? And first, I'd just like to be pretty specific about what we mean, or what we're talking about here by the internet. You know, the internet has become a really pervasive thing in our lives. Just when you think about the fact that we're on our phones all the time, but beyond that, we also have houses now that you can control your heating system over your mobile devices, and I think 10% of cars are now built with computerized systems that are connected to networks, and hopefully in the future we'll have driverless cars. That would be pretty cool. The fact that so many things in our life are connected over the internet, and we don't have a way to measure or define what exactly is the internet. So that's a great challenge in coming up with a report like this today. what is the effect of the internet on the economy. So first off, we kind of define a scope of the internet using a term called ICT, or Information Communications Technology. And basically what information communications technology is just everything that all the goods and services that facilitate the communication of information. It's actually probably, you could say, a broader term than the internet, and it actually far predates the invention of the internet, going back to ancient times, and even a couple of centuries ago, the telegraph, which developed and then going into the telephone. So ICT has been around for a while, and we use this as a category of goods that we measure, and then using that category of goods, we can come up with a measure of how much ICT has impacted the economy. And going into the second part of this title here, how much is the internet worth to the US economy? What are we measuring the economy by when we say the internet has a huge impact on the economy? We actually are focused on measuring the economy in terms of gross output, but also the growth of gross output, economic growth. And I think the reason why we focused on this metric the most was because a lot of times when people talk about the internet and the great potential the internet has, we look at how fast the internet sector has grown. And so looking at growth really makes sense because people say, oh, the internet's growing so fast, so it must be really boosting our economic growth rate in general. So that's what we sought out with our research, to come up with a way of quantifying that contribution to growth. So what did growth look like in the internet? Specifically during this time range, 1997 to 2007, which was the most recent 10 years of data that we had to measure the internet with. So over this 10 years, you can see in the second graph is the annualized growth rate. It was pretty consistently positive during these 10 years, averaging between 2 and 4% annually. And in the first graph, you can see that took us up a pretty high increase in GDP up until the Great Recession in 2007. So these 10 years were a pretty solid period of growth. And in our research, we divide this decade into 2 5-year intervals. As you can see, they're separated by the early 2000 recession. But yeah, over this time period, we had pretty solid growth. And I guess the interesting question is to see how much of this growth during this period was actually a result of the ICT sector growing. So the framework with which we measure how much each sector contributes to economic growth is based on pretty standard growth decomposition techniques. Basically, if you think of the economy as a machine and you feed in a lot of different types of inputs, say labor, materials, capital, those sorts of things, the machine will feed out output, which we measure as gross output. That's how we measure the economy. So using a framework where we categorize inputs as different, we categorize inputs and figure out how much each category of inputs contributes to gross output over time, we can better figure out how much contribution comes from each of these inputs. The way we categorize the inputs is based on a standard called CLEMS, and that basically stands for capital, labor, energy, materials, and services. Using this framework, we're able to see how much, say, capital contributed to output in a given year. And going off this standard framework, we go further and divide the inputs into ICT-related inputs versus non-ICT-related inputs. And aggregating the ICT-related inputs together, we're able to come up with a metric for measuring the ICT sector's contribution to growth. So just to be a little bit more concrete about what the ICT sector is, we divide capital and services specifically into ICT capital and non-ICT capital, and the same for services, ICT services and non-ICT services. So what are some things that are found that we classify as ICT capital and ICT services? So in ICT capital, we include things like the production of computers, radio and broadcasting equipment, semiconductors, those sorts of ICT, information communications technologies. And for ICT services, on the other hand, we include things like the provision of telecommunications services, internet service, data processing services, and also the publication of new software. All these sorts of things are categorized as ICT services. And to kind of come up with all of these measurements of these different types of inputs that are classified as ICT, we use the Bureau of Economic Analysis benchmark input-output tables, which are published every 5 years. And basically, these input and output tables provide data, a view of the economy at a very detailed level. It breaks down gross output at a very granular level, so you can look at all the different sorts of, you could look at how much of output comes from the production of computers, for example. And we re-aggregate all of this data at the granular level into larger chunks so you can actually measure what we define as the ICT sector, which is ICT capital and ICT services. So going back to this slide, you can see we have a whole classification of inputs into different categories over the CLEMS standard. So how much do each of these categories actually contribute in a given year? This is what the data kind of look like. Highlighted in the colors are the ICT sector inputs. In the green, you can see ICT capital, which comprises about 1% of the gross output over this decade. And in the blue, you can see ICT services, which is also pretty small, just under 3% over this decade for each of the 2 periods. So as you can see, ICT for a given year isn't a huge part of the economy, which just means, you know, a lot of output, or a small part of output, is actually ICT related in our economy. But I guess what's interesting is that when you look at it from a growth perspective, these ICT sectors are actually sectors that are growing much faster than the rest of the economy, as you can see here. So over this period, in the green bars, you can kind of see the growth rates, how much the economy grew during the 2 5-year periods. In the first period, the gross output grew by about $3 trillion, and in the second period, from 2002 to 2007, output grew even more by $4.6 trillion. So that's some pretty solid growth over that decade. And using our method for decomposing the growth into different factor contributions, we see that now ICT services has a huge effect on what we measure growth. So even though ICT services on its own is a pretty small category of inputs, they are actually contributing disproportionately a large amount to the growth rate of the economy. In the blue, you see that ICT services from 1997 to 2002 made up almost 20% of the growth in the entire economy as we measured. And then in the second period, almost 10%. So that's a pretty substantial chunk, given just combining the slides from the previous slides and this one. You can see that ICT services contributes a huge amount to growth despite being a pretty small sector on its own. ICT capital basically contributes to growth the same proportion as proportionally with respect to its size. And that just means that it's growing at a comparable rate to the overall economy. But we see that services has been a really fast exploding sector in the economy. So this is at the national level, just looking at the growth of the U.S. economy with respect to gross output. Using the same method, we also can apply this to at the individual industry level. So we looked at about 20 industries and looked at the industries with a large amount of their growth over this period being a result of the ICT sector growing. And just listed here for the 2 5-year intervals, we see the top industries that had more than 10% of their growth as a result of the ICT sector growing. And here we have industries that you would probably expect to see here, things like education, which has a lot of investments in ICT-related output, information services, administrative services, management, government. All these sectors actually relied pretty heavily on ICT growth for their growth as industries. So that's just another way that you can use the method outlined in our paper to come up with measurements of this impact that ICT has had on the economy. So I'm just going to wrap up with the key takeaways that I found from this research. It's just that we have this new data that we've compiled from the Bureau, the BEA's input-output tables, where you can actually come up with a quantification of the internet's impact on output growth over time. Using that kind of method, we were able to find that ICT had a pretty solid contribution to growth, especially in services. It's really a fast-growing industry. And ICT services has just, with its fast growth rate, has contributed to growth over this decade, disproportionately for its size. And finally, you can also extend our framework to look at the industry level and look at even more granular levels of the economy, which is a pretty flexible way to look at things. So just going back to what Harold said, people are always talking about how much the economy going forward will rely on the booming tech sector and ICT, internet, those sorts of things. And I think it's important to just have some way of taking the data that we collect in the government and coming up with measures for exactly how much different sectors are contributing, including the ICT sector. And it'll really inform our decisions going forward. So.
Let me just add a few points to what Jeff was saying. The technique we used can be contrasted in a couple of ways. One is assume that the exact same combinations of resources had been put into the economy in recent years as had been put into the economy in 1997 and 2002. Then from an economic basis, assuming the technology had remained constant, we just would expect that the economy would move in the same way and the ICT sector would contribute its share of output to economic growth, which would be around 4%. What our research shows is that might be the sort of the null hypothesis, what one would have expected to happen if the ICT sector was not doing something disproportional to that. What we're finding is actually dramatically different, something dramatically more than 4% of economic growth during this time period is attributable to the ICT sector. We isolated the effects of capital and services because those are specific to the ICT sector. You can think about ICT or internet-related capital, and you can think about ICT or internet-related services it's a lot harder to think about ICT or internet-related energy, which is one of the other major inputs, or intermediate inputs or materials. The one we didn't do, which might be interesting to do the next time around, is to look at the effect of ICT-related labor. That is to say, people with specific skills, say, computer programming skills. We didn't do that on this round, and that might be interesting to see what the effect of that would be. You may be wondering why we look at the period 1997 to 2007. Why don't we look through 2013? And the reason is as follows. We are using information that is consistent with the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Economic Analysis, and we're pulling a lot of information out of their input-output model. And the information for that is done in the 5-year business census that the Department of Commerce conducts in years beginning with 2s and 7s. And it takes the department a long time to collect and analyze that information, and then they go back and put it into their input-output analysis. And the 2007 information was released last September or so. We can hope that the 2012 information will come out less than 4 years from now, but I don't know exactly what the time schedule is at the Department of Commerce on that. One of the interesting results that we found, and we've puzzled about it, is the relative contribution of services relative to capital, and we found much more of an effect from services over the period 1997 to 2007 than capital. And we've puzzled over what the right interpretation of that is. I think part of it is that services are unambiguously positively consumed during this period of time, so that people are getting, whether it's just online broadband services or online internet search or any number of other services that are being consumed. And on the capital side, we have a situation where ICT-related capital is probably rapidly depreciating over this period of time. That if you take a laptop from 1997 or a server from 1997 and compare it with a laptop or server from 2002, well, the 1997 laptop is probably worthless in 2002 because the technology is changing so rapidly, and so the measurement of capital depreciation is going to affect the ICT capital measurement very much over this period of time, and that is going to be one reason that we may be finding so much more of an effect from services than we are for capital over this period of time. It's hard to believe that capital isn't important. It's hard to believe that capital is not a major contributor, but I think when you contrast it, when you have capital expenditures for capital that is rapidly depreciating over this period of time, that may be one of the explanations there. If we go back to the results that we found of essentially double-digit effects of the ICT sector, is just way out of line with the 4% gross output contribution of that sector. And it is, as Jeff described, there are just a lot of different segments of the economy that are using the internet and ICT components. And you saw in the industry-specific slides that he gave, so essentially every sector of the economy, some economic growth is attributable to the ICT sector. The input-output analysis model at the Bureau of Economic Analysis is they have two-digit level industries. They have how many? 30 or 40 industries, something like that. And the more granular you get with the industry level data, probably the less confidence that the data actually are accurate. So it's a trade-off. I think I probably tend to have more confidence in the aggregate national level data. But I think there's a consistent story that cuts across both the national level data and the industry level data, which is that the ICT sector had a disproportionate effect on economic growth during this period of time. All of which leads up to one of the great puzzles of the sector. If you look at the period of time in which the federal government has been measuring economic activity with any degree of sophistication, which goes back to probably the late 20s or early 30s, the period of time over that we might call the internet age, say the past 20 years or so, has actually been one of the periods of slowest economic growth in American history. Now think about that for a moment. Here we have one of the great technological innovations of all times, and yet economic growth in the United States has been slow. And why is that? This is something that has been puzzling us for years, and I think was one of the motivations for the research, is to try to figure out how do we measure the effect of the internet in an economy that actually isn't growing all that fast. We know it's having a profound effect, and our measurements based on very standard economic techniques shows that it accounts for a disproportionate amount of the economic growth in the economy, and yet it hasn't translated into substantial economic growth for the overall economy. And this remains one of the great puzzles of our time. Is it that the internet is being constrained? If we just really let it develop even more, that the economy would be pulled along? Or is the interpretation that but for the internet, our economy would be doing really badly? That this has just been one of the few highlights. I don't think there are simple answers to these and related questions. I do think that our research, the results of our research, do suggest some areas for further research. And I would begin with a fairly basic observation, which is I think that that our federal government can and should be doing a better job of organizing economic data. Our economic data tend to be organized consistent with an economy 20 or 30 years ago, but we have not really kept pace. There are parts that we do. We have some measures at the Department of Commerce of online activity. It's a separate seminar. I'm not convinced we do that very well. But there are lots of parts of the internet economy that we just don't measure very well. And to the extent we think it's really an important part of the economy, we probably should be trying to organize our economic data in a better way. I think if we look at the policy questions that I opened the seminar with, whether it's on tax policy or labor policy or education policy or regulatory policy, I think the results of our research suggest that this sector has been very important to economic growth, and that may be a caution sign towards regulating it more. But the specific activity it's very difficult to bring it up to the current times. It's very difficult to look at the past 5 years with the techniques that we have used here. You'd have to use some other techniques to measure the economic contribution of the internet or the ICT sector. I think we have no reason to believe that the contribution has slowed. I think, if anything, it's probably accelerated since 2007. But I think to come up with precise quantifications of the types that we've presented here in this paper, that's we're sort of hopelessly held back by the lack of more current information. Jeff?
I also think one of the problems is that I don't ever think will be solved is that a lot of product and usefulness that we get from the internet, if you just think about the way we use the internet, we spend like several hours of the day on the internet and we read articles and all this free information that's available out there, but it's unpriced. So unlike a lot of physical goods where we go and buy it and those are taken into account into government data, there's no way to measure this unpriced, unvalued product that we actually do value quite highly in our life, and increasingly so. So I think that's just one issue that we'll never be able to measure. And our results here today just give you a baseline of what the internet contributes to the economy, but it's definitely not all that it contributes.
I think that's fair. I think it's a very fair assessment. A lot of the internet is dealing with services that are priced at zero or very close to zero, and that's very different from a lot of other innovations in the economy over the years. With that, we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. I see some in the back. Do we have a microphone?
Henry Hedger, researcher at NARA. I wonder if you'd like to comment on what the press constantly discusses regarding the internet commerce war between the strict internet firm, which is sort of invisible to the public but very apparent on the web, and the brick and mortar shops, which are basically suffering due to this great success of the internet. We always hear of another companies on the verge of bankruptcy or reducing the number of its brick and mortar shops, or perhaps offering to meet the price of the internet company precisely in order to save a sale. Despite the cost of them of absorbing the brick and mortar shop overhead, which cuts into their profits substantially. Do you have any comments on this problem?
The question has to do with the substitution, if you will, for a lot of online activity for what traditionally happened in more brick and mortar shops, and that was not part of our paper. I'm quite familiar with the issue, but that really was outside of the scope of what we're looking at. Although I think it does touch on the idea that there are large segments of the economy outside of the ICT sector that have dramatically changed as a result of the internet over the past 20 years. And ordinary provision of the retail sector has been affected as much as any by substitution from people going to shops, seeing what they're purchasing, making the purchase at a store, to online purchase activities. And there's a lot of issues from land use to sales tax to just the economy of local downtown Main Street communities that's changed as a result. Next question here on the gentleman here. Yeah, be great.
Thank you. Jesse Barnett, also Hudson Institute. Jeff, in your presentation, you noted that just about every sector has grown as a result of the proliferation of ICT technologies. But I'm curious, and I guess kind of tapping into the previous question, were you able to identify in the data any sectors that had contracted as a result, had suffered, creative destruction or whatever you would like to term it?
Yeah, I definitely did find that to be true, and it's undeniable. You have sectors like the newspaper industry that, definitely didn't benefit from the growth of ICT and other technologies. So that's just sort of the harsh fact of life. But yeah, I think that's kind of the cool thing, that you can use this data to kind of measure how much different industries were impacted by the ICT sector.
Lady here up front.
Hi, I'm from the Straits Times, a Singapore newspaper. Just on the data, for the first 5 years, so there was a 20% economic growth. Well, the ICT sector accounted for 20%, and then it went down to 10% in the next 5 years. So could you maybe interpret that a little bit? Is there a drop? Do we also anticipate a drop in the next 5 years after that? Or why was there a 20% to a 10% drop in this time? And also, could you tell me, on a regulatory level, what can be done to encourage the growth in the ICT sector, or should it even be encouraged? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So the first question about the drop in the contribution to growth. So the first period, the ICT services, that contributed almost 20%, and the next period it contributed about 10%. And I think if you look at if you compare the two periods, it's you also have to take into account the fact that the second period had a much higher growth rate in general. So I don't know, maybe 20% in the first period is actually equivalent to 10% in the next period. You'd have to do out the math, but as far as there might be some other reasons why ICT started to slow down after 2002. I don't know. It might be.
It's a good question. I don't think we have an answer to it. The coincidence of the years, 2002 was the sort of the depth of the 2001 to 2002 recession, and it also there was the quote-unquote dot-com bubble going on almost exactly during that period of time. I don't know that we have not been able to tease out the specific cause of why you see a greater contribution 97-2002 than you do 2002 to 2007. 2002 to 2007, as Jeff said, was pretty consistently an expansion period, whereas 97 to 2002 was not. But I don't think we don't have an answer specifically on that. I don't think I would extrapolate 2 points to make a permanent trend. I think the broader point is that the ICT sector was contributing vastly more than its economic share to economic growth during that period. In terms of policy prescription, this period, 97 to 2007, was a period of, I would characterize it as deregulation in the telecommunications industry. I think it's consistent with saying that less regulation certainly helped economic growth. It didn't hurt it. It's not, I think it'd be very difficult to interpret these results as a prescription for greater regulatory intervention. Gentleman in the pink shirt.
Hi, Will Reinhardt from the American Action Forum. So this is part of a larger conversation I know you guys are part of about the solo paradox. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the lack, essentially the lack of, you know, as Solo said, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you guys have talked about that in the paper. I haven't read through it closely, but I was wondering if you could just talk about that issue, which I know is a big, huge question both in the academy and then obviously for policy people and, you know, wonks like myself who are interested obviously in the productivity side.
Yeah, Solo noted that in late 80s. Yeah. And the backdrop there is as computers replaced secretaries in the workplace in the 1970s and 1980s, there was no real observed measurement of improved productivity in the U.S. economy. I have many favorite Bob Solo quotes, but my favorite one was technological change is we have to suspend our disbeliefs or something like that. It's what we can't measure. I think part of what Solo was noting in the 1980s holds true today, which is there are a lot of factors that affect economic growth, and technology is but one of them. And trying to tease out the specific effect of technological change, which we have tried, and I think we've actually done about as much with that during that period of time as probably can be done. And we found a lot, but the bigger picture of saying, why is it that we're seeing this technological change from the internet, yet we're not seeing the broader economic growth? I think that's a real puzzle. And I think that is what Solo was getting at in the 1980s. And if we don't have an answer to that question in our paper. Generally speaking, I think regulatory overhang has a very harmful effect on the economy, and I think it probably has a particularly harmful effect on new technologies such as the internet. Yeah. Question in the back.
Hi, this is Adam Bettman from Monument. This is just a question for clarification. From 1997 to 2002, that was $582 billion that was spurred along that period? Or is that from one of the 5-year intervals?
Which table are you looking at?
This was on the pamphlet that you handed out, but you noted that 1997 to 2002 and 2002 to 2007, there was adding about $582 billion from the ITC sector. And then this leads me to my next question, because you noted that it was $340 billion in 2013, but I thought you didn't receive any information from recent years. So I was curious as to what that number actually represents.
The way we came up with that number was by extrapolating the contributions. Like I said, from 1997 to 2002, the ICT services contributed 20% to the growth rate. And then taking that growth rate, we looked at gross output, which we do have data on for 2013, and extrapolated those contribution rates. What we don't have for 2013 is the data at the very granular level, where you can take things like computer production and add it all up and find the total contribution of the ICT sector. Right, yep.
Other questions? Well, if not, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and look forward to seeing you on the 18th of September with Representative Anna Eshoo. Thank you very much.